Hello, learners. I am Deepu Basumutari, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Kistakanta Handik State Open University. Today, we'll be discussing Unit 7 titled Naive Realism, a direct perspective on perceptions from the paper on Fundamentals Concept of Philosophy. This unit will be covered in one video. In today's video, we will explore the detailed discussion of the concept of naive realism and the criticism attached to it. So let's begin the video with a general understanding of naive realism. Naive realism or direct realism is the philosophical view that perception provides direct and accurate apprehension of the external world. It posits that object events such as trees, cars, table exist independently of our perception of them, maintaining their properties regardless of whether anyone observes them. According to this theory, when we perceive an object, we are directly aware of the object itself, not a mental image or representations. For example, when you see a tree, neorealism asserts that you are directly seeing the tree with its actual leaves, bark, and branches rather than a constructed internal representation. The qualities we perceive, such as the greenness of the grass or hardness of a rock, are considered real properties inherent in the objects themselves, not dependent on our minds. This direct connection suggests that perception is a reliable source of knowledge about the world, offering an accurate reflection of reality. Neorealism contrasts with representationalism and indirect realism, which argue that perception involves mental representation shaped by sensory input and cognitive processes. These theories propose that perception may be influenced by subjective factors, creating a potential gap between the world as it is and how we experience it. In neorealism, however, no such mediation exists. Perception is viewed as straightforward, unmediated relationship between the perceiver and the external world, ensuring that sensory experiences align closely with reality. This intuitive perspective supports the belief that the world is as it appears, providing a clear and trustworthy understanding of its objects and properties. So, learners, after discussing the core essence of neorealism, we will now focus upon the core concept of neorealism. The first is direct perception. Neorealism, also known as direct realism, asserts that perception is a direct and immediate interaction with the external world. It holds that when we perceive an object, we are directly aware of the object itself, not mediated by mental images or representations. For example, when you see a red apple, neorealism claims that you are perceiving the actual apple and its redness without any intermediary process that creates a mental version of it. This view contrasts with theories like representationalism or indirect realism, which suggests that perception involves mental representation constructed by the brain, potentially creating a veil of perception that separates us from the true nature of objects. In neorealism, no such veil exists. We perceive objects and their properties exactly as they are. The qualities we attribute to objects, such as the redness of an apple, or are considered real features of those objects, not subjective experiences shaped by the mind. Neorealism aligns with everyday intuition as we generally trust our senses to provide a reliable understanding of the world. By perceiving objects directly, it argues we gain true knowledge of their existence and properties without questioning the validity of our sensory experiences. In summary, neorealism presents perception as a direct encounter with reality, where objects and their properties are fully accessible and accurately reflected in our sensory experiences. Second is the independence of objects. The learners, neorealism holds that objects in the external world exist independently of our perception and possess inherent properties such as color, shape, size, and texture. According to this view, objects like trees, rocks, or chairs maintain their characteristics regardless of whether anyone perceives them. For example, a tree in a forest retains its greenness, height, and form even when no one is there to observe it. This perspective stands in contrast to idealist philosophies such as subjective idealism, which suggests that the existence or properties of objects depend on their being perceived. Philosophers like George Berkeley, for instance, argue that an object's qualities, such as the greenness of grass or the roundness of a ball, exist only as long as they are being perceived by a conscious mind. Without perception, these qualities might not have any meaningful existence. Neorealism rejects such notions, insisting that world consists of objects with properties that are independent of observers. For instance, if a ball is left in an empty room, it continues to exist with all its attributes, its roundness, color, and texture, unaltered by the absence of an observer. This view aligns with everyday intuition, which assumes that world and its features remain constant even when unobserved. In contrast to idealism, neorealism affirms the existence of an objective reality that doesn't rely on perception. It upholds the belief that objects and their properties exist and remain as they are, irrespective of whether anyone perceives them, supporting a common sense understanding of the world. The next point is transparency of experience. Dear learners, neorealism posits that our perceptual experiences are transparent, which means that when we perceive something, we are directly aware of the object itself, not of any intermediate processes or representations that might mediate that perceptions. This idea of transparency suggests that our perception functions like a clear, unobstructed window, allowing us to see the world exactly as it is without any distortion, alteration, or interpretation by our cognitive faculties. To elaborate on this concept, consider the experience of looking at a painting. According to neorealism, when you look at the painting, you are not seeing an internal mental image or a constructed representation of the painting in your mind. Instead, you are directly seeing the painting itself with all its colors, textures, and details, just as they exist in the real world. Your experience of the painting is thought to be a direct encounter with the object, unmediated by any cognitive or perceptual processes that could change or influence what you see. This view stands in contrast to other theories of perception that suggest our perceptual experiences are shaped by internal processes, such as the brain's interpretation of sensory data. For example, some theories argue that what we perceive is a mental representation or construct of the object rather than the object itself. In this views, perception involves a complex process where the brain takes in sensory information and then creates an internal image or impression that we consciously experience. This internal image might not exactly match the object in the world, as it could be influenced by various factors such as memory, expectations, or the limitation of our sensory organs. Neorealism rejects this notion of intermediary step between the object and our perception of it. Instead, it maintains that our perceptual experience provides direct access to the external world. When you see a tree, you are seeing the actual tree with all its properties such as greenness, height, and shape, as it exists independently of your perception. There is no veil of perceptions, no layer of internal processing that might distort or mediate your experience of the tree. The idea of transparency in realism implies that Our senses provide a direct and accurate window into the world. When you hear a bird singing, you are directly hearing the sound produced by the bird, not an internal representation of that sound. When you touch a rough surface, you are directly feeling the roughness of the surface itself, not an internal sensation or interpretation of roughness. This perspective aligns with our everyday experience and common sense understanding of perception. We generally believe that when we see, hear, or touch something, we are interacting directly with the objects in the world as they are. Naive realism reinforces these beliefs by asserting that our perceptual experiences are straightforward and transparent, without any need for cognitive interpretations or reconstructions. However, critics of naive realism argue that perception is not as straightforward as this view suggests. They point to various phenomena such as optical illusions, perceptual errors, and the influence of prior knowledge and expectation on perceptions as evidence that our experience of the world is not always a direct reflection of reality. According to these critics, our cognitive faculties do play a role in shaping how we perceive the world, meaning that what we see, hear, feel is not always a perfect representation of the external objects themselves. In summary, neorealism holds that our perceptual experiences are transparent, meaning we directly perceive objects in the world as they are, without any mediations or distortion by our cognitive faculties. This view likens perception to looking through a clear window, where we see the world exactly as it is, without any alterations. Critics, however, argue that perception is more complex and that our experiences are shaped by internal processes, challenging the naive realist claim of transparency. The learner next is criticism of naive realism. First point is illusions and hallucinations. One of the strongest challenges to naive realism comes from the existence of perceptual illusions. For example, a straight stick appears bent when partially submerged in water. Even though it is not actually bent, this suggests that our perception does not always align with reality, challenging the idea that we perceive the world exactly as it is. Hallucination present an even more severe challenge. In a hallucination, a person perceives something that is not actually there, such as seeing a person in a room and no one is present. This phenomenon raises questions about the reliability perceptions, whether it can be considered a direct encounter with reality. The second criticism is scientific evidence. Neuroscientific research has shown that perception involves complex processes in the brain, where sensory data is processed, interpreted, and sometimes altered before it becomes part of our conscious experience. This evidence suggests that perception is not as direct as neorealism claims. Instead, it is mediated by cognitive processes that can shape or even distort what we perceive. For instance, experiments have demonstrated that what we perceive can be influenced by expectations, past experiences, and context, indicating that our perceptions are not purely objective reflection of the external world. The next criticism is argument from perspective. The argument from perspective notes that our perception of the object changes depending on our viewpoint. For example, a building looks different from a distance than it does up close, and the color of an object might appear different under various lighting conditions. This variability suggests that perception is not merely a direct encounter with the object, but is influenced by external conditions in our own positions as observers. This variation challenges the naive realist claim that we perceive objects exactly as they are, pointing instead to the idea that perception is influenced by various factors. Next, learner, we will move into the defense of naive realism. Realism is often championed for its strong alignment with common sense intuitions about how we perceive the world in our daily experiences. We typically operate under the assumption that what we see, hear, and touch corresponds, corresponds directly to the way things actually are in the world. For instance, when we see a red apple on a table, we naturally believe that apple exists as a real, tangible object, that its redness is true property of the apple itself. This straightforward view of perception is deeply embedded in our everyday thinking, interaction with the world, because realism resonates with these common sense beliefs. It is sometimes referred to as common sense realism. Proponents of realism argue that this alignment with common sense is a significant strength of the theory. They suggest that our natural, intuitive understanding of perception should not be easily dismissed, as it reflects the way we reliably navigate the world. According to this view, the world is populated with objects that possess stable properties, such as color, shape, size, that we perceive directly. This perception is seen as a simple, unmediated connection between the observer and the external world, which makes it appealing and straightforward explanation for how we experience reality. Next, exceptions rather than the rule. Defenders of realism acknowledge that there are cases where our perception do not align perfectly with reality, such as in the case of optical illusions, hallucinations, or perceptual errors. However, they argue that these instances are exceptions rather than the rule. According to realists, while these anomalies occur, they do not significantly undermine the overall reliability of perception. Instead, they are considered rare and special cases that do not reflect the general nature of how we perceive the world. Nave realists maintain that for the vast majority of our perceptual experiences, what we perceive corresponds accurately to the way things are. For example, when we see a chair, touch its surface, and sit on it, our perceptions are consistent with the existence and properties of the chair. These everyday interactions, which happen without issue, reinforce the idea that our senses generally provide a trustworthy account of the external world. Moreover, realists often argue that even when we encounter illusions or hallucinations, we have ways of recognizing and correcting for these perceptual errors. For instance, if we are aware that a certain visual effect is an illusion, we can mentally adjust our perception to align more closely with reality. This ability to detect, account for perceptual anomalies is seen as further evidence of the general reliability of perception. It suggests that while not infallible, our perceptual systems are strong enough to provide an accurate understanding of the world in most circumstances. By emphasizing the alignment with common sense and the reliability of perception in everyday situation, realists argue that their theory offers a compelling and intuitively satisfying account of how we interact with the world. They suggest that while more complex theories of perceptions might account for the exceptions, they often do so at the cost of complicating or even contradicting the straightforward common sense view that naive realism affords. This makes naive realism an attractive position for those who value simplicity and directness in explaining human perception. Next, learner, we have come to the conclusion. In the conclusion, it can be said that naive realism presents a simple and intuitive perspective on perception, asserting that we perceive the world directly as it truly exist. According to this view, the objects we encounter in our daily life, such as trees, tables, or other people, exist independently of our perception. When we see a tree, for instance, we are directly aware of the tree itself with all its properties like its color, shape, and size, just as they are in the real world. Neorealism suggests that our perceptual experiences are like transparent windows, providing us with an unmediated view of the world. This means that what we perceive is exactly what is out there, with no distortion, alterations, or internal processes influencing our experience. The theory aligns well with our everyday understanding of the world and how we interact with it, offering a common sense approach to the nature of perceptions. Despite the intuitive appeal of neorealism, it faces significant challenges from both philosophical arguments and scientific findings that suggest perception is more complex than a direct encounter with reality. Critics of neorealism argue that our perceptual experiences are not as straightforward as the theory suggests. For example, phenomena like optical illusions, perceptual errors, and the influence of cognitive factors such as expectations, prior knowledge, and memory indicate that perception involves more than just a direct relationship with external objects. These challenges have sparked ongoing debates in the philosophy of perceptions, with various alternative theories proposing that our experiences are mediated by internal processes that shape how we perceive the world. One of the major criticism comes from the idea that perception is not merely a passive reception of sensory data, but an active process that involves interpretation and construction by the brain. For instance, when we look at an object, our brain processes the sensory input and constructs a mental representation of that object, which may not be an exact match to the object itself. This process suggests that there is a veil of perception, a layer of internal processing that stands between us and the world, challenging the naive realist claim of transparency. Moreover, scientific research in the field, such as cognitive psychology, neuroscience, has provided evidence that perception is influenced by a variety of factors, including context, attention, and even emotional states. These findings suggest that our perceptual experiences are not purely objective encounters with the world, but are shaped by internal mechanisms that filter and interpret sensory information. In response to these challenges, some philosophers have defended neorealism by refining or modifying its core claims. They argue that while perception might involve some level of processing, this doesn't necessarily undermine the directness of our awareness of the world. Other propose hybrid theories that incorporate elements of neorealism while acknowledging the role of internal processes in shaping perception. On the other hand, alternative theories such as indirect realism, representationalism, and idealism offer different accounts of perception, emphasizing the role of mental representation, the mediation of experience by cognitive structures, or even the dependence of reality on perception itself. These theories attempt to address the complexities of perception that neorealism seems to overlook. The debate between neorealism and its alternatives continues to be a central issue in the philosophy of perception. It raises important questions about the nature of reality, the limits of human cognitions, and the reliability of our senses. While neorealism provides a straightforward and appealing explanation of how we perceive the world, the challenges it faces highlights the need for a deeper understanding of the intricate relationship between our minds and the external world. This ongoing debate underscores the complexity of perception and various ways in which philosophers and scientists seek to understand how we experience and interact with reality. So, learner, today we have explored the fascinating concept of naive realism, also known as direct realism, which offers a straightforward perspective on perceptions. We have discussed how this theory posits that we perceive the world exactly as it is, without any mediation by mental representations or constructs. Through our session, we examined the core principle of naive realism, its strength in grounding perception in a common sense view of reality, and some of the philosophical challenges it faces, such as illusions and perceptual errors. We also touch upon its importance in the broader debate about the nature of perception in philosophy. Thank you for staying with me till the end of this video. See you in the next video. Keep learning and exploring. Thank you.